with demand expected to come back, the question remains, does this mean the economy is back on track?
Companies now, after experimenting with offshore in places like India, Philippines, and Poland, want to bring those jobs back.
We invest in the U.S. We're the biggest exporter in the country. In the cycle we're in right now, we're creating jobs.
From Radio America, it's Neil Asbury's Made in America, the show that explores American industry, large and small, and promotes American-made products everywhere. Put Neil Asbury's Made in America to work for you.
A very big welcome to you today. I'm your host, Neil Asbury, together with co-host Dr. Rich Ruffin. So, Rich, you know, in a marketplace filled with discussions around tariffs and trade wars, think about this. The U.S. economy grew 4.2% in the second quarter.
Revised up.
Yeah, revised up. And can that be sustained? Well, you know, everybody said, oh, we're going to have a trade war, the market's going to crash. Well, that hasn't happened yet. NASDAQ and the S&P 500 reach all-time highs. You know, so it looks like people are not worried about American corporate profits. Are they believing that these tariffs are going to result in better trade deals? Well, right now we're seeing Europe negotiating in a very different way. They're saying, and they're at least telegraphing right now that, hey, let's just get rid of tariffs on all cars. You got Canada, you know, rushing to Washington, who wants to be part of this new Mexico trade deal, U.S.-Mexico trade deal. And, you know, they're going to make a deal. Let's face it. I mean, you know, Canada very much depends on the United States and we on Canada. It's a very, very important partnership, very important economically, culturally. You know, Canada is going to come in and it's going to be a better deal. It's going to be a better deal for American workers. It's going to be a better deal for Canadian workers. I think everyone's going to benefit from these trade deals. So it's very, very fascinating. We're going to have a wonderful show today. We're going to really zero in on some of these topics that have a really big impact on your jobs. But first, we're going to talk about temporary labor and just a temporary culture that we've created in our country. Everything is to be temporary. You know, everything seems to be disposable, right? Everything's temporary. Your job is temporary. You move on to this. You now do that. You know, it's great, though. I mean, people are experiencing different things, getting all kinds of different things in their life, experiences in their life, and moving on and doing bigger and better things. So is that a good thing? We're very pleased to have on the show Professor Louis Hyman. He is at Cornell University. He's got a new book out. He's written several. And his latest book is Temp, How American Work, American Business, and the American Dream Became Temporary. Very, very fascinating thought. Professor Hyman, welcome to Made in America.
I really appreciate it.
So tell us about your book. And, you know, one of the things was, you know, it's like this, the workforce. I mean, it's changed in the way that culturally the workforce has changed. And, you know, how is America going to remain prosperous in all this economic growth that we have? You know, so what is driving this more temporary approach to the American workplace or the American career for that matter?
Yeah, all around us today, we see these numbers that make it seem like the economy is booming, and yet so many people feel like it's not working for them. We feel more insecure than we have ever before, and, you know, for the last 40 years, we've seen wage stagnation and income volatility and workplace insecurity rise. And so this book is about the history of the business decisions, the policy decisions that made that happen. And, you know, in the end, how to make this booming economy work for the rest of us as well.
Well, and it's very interesting because the stats out there are very good. And, you know, we have the lowest unemployment in the black community since they kept the numbers, lowest Hispanic unemployment since they've kept the numbers. The female employment is the highest it's been in decades, doing very, very well. We have the highest employment for teenagers. So we all seem to be going in the right direction. And then just this week, the report came out that U.S. workers report the highest job satisfaction since 2005. And recently, in the last few weeks, Neil, we've been talking about people are becoming nomadic again, that they have a chance to quit their job and go look for another job because there are more jobs
in a different location.
Yeah, I mean absolutely, just move
like across state lines.
Yeah, and so
like across the country.
So here's my question, and I think it's a good one, and that is if in fact, you know, the stats are coming out that there's high satisfaction, people are able to quit their job and go find another job. and the numbers are looking right now, and the GDP is around, last the quarter we're talking about now up to 4.2%. So how does this, juxtapose to what we're talking about just a few minutes ago, where the people are not feeling well?
So it's controversial. Well, it's not controversial. It's just you can see the inconsistency in the numbers. So on the one hand, you have the unemployment number, which is people looking for work in the last couple of weeks and whether they found it, and that's really low. But on the other hand, you have about 6 to 8% of the population of the workforce that has dropped out since 2008, and it's this set of people that is just permanently out of the workforce that feels like this economy is not working for them. That is really the source of the insecurity. And so what we need to do is figure out ways to reconnect those workers, especially those rural workers, with the booming economy of the cities that is going so well. And, we've done this before, we can do it again. But I think this question of nomadic, for me, the question is about autonomy, those core American values of independence and self-reliance that, we're all nostalgic for that post-war paycheck, but we really traded security for, autonomy. And so I think today, in today's sort of world of independent contracting and the independent workforce, or the gig economy, as people often call it, it's a real opportunity for Americans to gain control over their work lives once again. And we're really at a crossroads to decide how that looks.
And how do we do that? What would that look like? You said get the rural communities that may not have the job opportunities and getting them plugged into the areas that have the job opportunities. My family's from Appalachia, and my father left, and when I was very young, and we went to New Jersey. But most of he came from a family of 12, and they all stayed there, and that's where they want to be. Even if they would come and stay with us in New Jersey, they would all go back to West Virginia. Everybody wanted to be there, and they still want to be there, but they want jobs to be there, and unfortunately, they're not there. And, how do we get these people plugged in? Like you said, in rural America, how do we get them plugged in to this economy that is working so well that Rich brought up, but in their part of the country, it's not working well? Do we just forget about them? That would be the wrong thing to do.
Or Neil, do we retrain them? Do we go into these apprentice programs?
But you got to bring the jobs there, though. It's like, okay, well, go to the city. Well, they don't want to be in this city. They want to be where they are. So how do we help these people?
Absolutely.
That's a good question.
So at Cornell, we have a program that we're getting off the ground this year called the Digital Countryside Initiative, because we're a rural university. And the idea is that, you can train some people. Some people who are coal miners can become coders. But most people who don't want to do that, most people, first of all, most Americans don't go to college because they don't have the opportunity, or simply because they don't want to or don't have the capacity. And so we need to make sure that the economy isn't just built around people who can become more highly skilled, but for regular folks. And amazingly today, there's all kinds of digital platforms like Upwork or Etsy, where you can take the skills you already have, whether that's handicraft or, simply answering phones or being a receptionist, things that you think you might have to be in person to do, and you can do them over the internet. But it's going to require a big cultural shift about how we think about what work looks like. And we need to support people as they make this transition.
Well, and I think that's very, very interesting. And but I guess what you're really saying is that we need to get corporations to invest in certain areas. Is that what you're going at, Neil? We have to give some incentive to have companies move and establish? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I don't know what the solution is, because, there's been administration after administration that goes there in campaigns and says, we're going to go and do what's right for rural America. They get elected and nothing happens. Professor Hyman is saying, hey, with the internet economy, people don't go there. They don't necessarily have to go there to invest. The infrastructure's not there. There's a lot of things. It's an out-of-the-way place. For whatever reason, economically, it just doesn't seem to work. And the government, whatever incentives have been offered, it's not enough to get people to respond. So is there an e-commerce solution to all of this, Professor?
I think there is certainly e-commerce can be a part of the solution for people who don't want to leave their communities. Many of these communities are very beautiful. In my book, I write about a woman who lives 2 hours north of Flint, Michigan, not a particularly prosperous, community, Flint, Michigan, and then 2 hours north of that, you can only imagine. Well, she works for making about $30 an hour as a receptionist in Palo Alto by telecommuting. And, she does it every day. It's stable work. It's secure work. It's just done through a digital labor platform. And I think there's a lot of opportunities like that. And we need to help companies learn about how they can hire people remotely like this. And we need to help workers learn how valuable they are, how they have skills that are already in demand without having to go back to school and without having to retrain.
Hey, Louis, thanks a lot. We've been listening to Louis Hyman, who's a professor at Cornell University, and his latest book, TEMP, How American Work, American Business, and the American Dream Became Temporary. Thanks for coming on the show, Professor.
A real pleasure. Thank you so much.
Coming up, Dr. Rothman and I are going to discuss a number of issues that came up in this week's headlines that have a big impact on your jobs.
Made in America.
Welcome to Made in America. I'm your host, Neil Asbury, together with co-host Dr. Rich Rothman. So, Rich, we're going to talk a lot about trade today. We're going to talk about NAFTA, or President Trump is saying, let's not call it NAFTA anymore. It's got a bad connotation. We're going to call it the United States-Mexico Trade Agreement.
I like
get real creative there.
It's hip. It's hip.
And, and then what's going to happen with Canada? Well, we're going to spend a lot of time on that. But there's a headline out this week that the EU says it's ready to abolish car tariffs, shifting its position.
That's right.
So that's a big story.
That's a big deal.
Right.
That's a very big deal. You know what it begs the question is, like, well, maybe do you think that the concept of threatening tariffs and being hard and putting America first is actually kind of working for the president?
Well, here's the deal, is that auto tariffs for our automobiles going to Europe are 10%.
That's right. And
the autos that we import are 2.5%, right? So it's 4 times greater, 400% more. That's a lot. Imagine if you were going to buy let's say, BMW, or you're going to buy a Volkswagen. I buy Mercedes. Or you buy a Mercedes.
Well, there you go.
Well, it would mean that you would be paying 7.5% more.
That's right.
Plus.
That's right.
Because, they make profits on those tariffs, and, people are making margins on top of these margins. So, it kind of escalates, and it's a lot of dollars. It's a lot of dollars different. And I wonder how many less European cars would be sold if the duties were 7.5% more. A lot less. That's a make or break situation.
Well, I think you're correct on that, and I keep listening to everyone, saying the president doesn't know what he's doing, and the administration's out of control, and Jared Kushner just is out of his league, and they're still worried about security clearance. I'm listening to all this garbage that's out there, but the more I think about it, look what's happening with China, look what's happening with Mexico right now. And people said, oh, my God, we're insulting Mexico. It's disgusting. It's never going to happen. And between last Friday and this week, they cut a deal. They worked right over the weekend. And by Tuesday of this week, they had an MOU that they were going to operate under.
And the thing about it is that Mexico just elected a new president, Lopez
His
Obrador.
Guys were there. They were sitting in the room.
Who's a real leftist. I have a lot of friends in Mexico. And a lot of people down there are afraid. The entrepreneurs, the small business class, the business class. This is really a nightmare scenario for those in Mexico, entrepreneurs in Mexico. And yet, he praised President Trump and said, hey, look, the president showed great respect towards Mexico in getting this deal done. So that's kind of interesting to have a ultra-left president of Mexico praising President Trump for respecting the country and getting a deal done in Mexico first. Everybody, the president's a racist, and he wants to build a wall, and he wants to secure the nation.
He'll never cut a deal.
he'll never cut a deal. And now you got a leftist president. I mean, not just a leftist, but like a way out there leftist, going to ultimately change the country. He's going to get out of NAFTA. Doesn't want to do business with the United States.
Going to legalize drugs.
And yet it looks like we're getting started on a really great foot here with the new president of Mexico. Hey, changing gears here in the United States, this race that's going to happen in Florida for the governor. I mean, it is really quite incredible. We have two candidates that could not be more polar opposite. I mean, we have someone who's left of Bernie Sanders here, the mayor of Tallahassee, that is running against someone who is a big-time Trump supporter. I mean, a lot of people say that Florida is a microcosm of the United States, right? It is. You got the northern Florida, very different than southern Florida. The different, this state, it's just such a diverse state. It's like the United States, just a smaller version. One
of the fastest growing, most successful states in the nation right now.
Everybody's going to be watching this. I mean, this is kind of like a bellwether for 2020.
That's exactly correct.
And it could very well be Bernie against President Trump. That could be the battle of the century here coming up.
Well, yeah, it could very, very well be. I mean, if we think about it, you have that Cortez lady up in New York, and she's far to the left. She's really way out there on the left. And Bernie Sanders running around planting Johnny Appleseed everywhere in the country to get his ideas across, which are obviously leftist and very progressive. And then here, out of the blue, you have a guy, Gillum, he just wants all these, he wants to eliminate ICE. There's no ICE. There's no borders. There's no boundaries. He wants to raise corporate taxes in Florida by 40%. Medicare, Medicaid for everybody. Just give it to them. We're going to do that. That's great. We're going to do that. But I think the thing that you just said is the scariest thing of them all, Neil. Raise corporate rates 40%, which would make just listen for a second. Here's what's the corporate rate in Florida right now? The corporate rate is about 3%?
It's very low.
Yeah, it's pretty low. But North Carolina is 3%, South Carolina is 5%, Mississippi is 6%, Tennessee is 6.5%, Alabama 6.5%, Gillum tax rate 7.75%. We're going to be the most expensive. How do we compete? How do we attract business? Florida's got a great base that's blooming and growing and all sorts of great ideas and great opportunities. And here we have a guy who I just want to say it under, investigation from up in Tallahassee with the FBI. He wants to come out. He's going to give all this stuff away, raise taxes, and make us non-competitive. Hey, but that's, just saying.
There's a lot more to be said for that because it looks like a lot of people thinking that Democrats are going to win a lot of races this time around.
Well, yeah, that's what Trotsky said before. What are they? Oh, that's right, they killed him. It could be worse.
Hey,
could be raining.
We're going to have to move on, but we got Chris Garcia coming up, the CEO of VICAR Financial, and he's the former deputy director of the U.S. Department of Commerce. We're going to talk about NAFTA. More trade discussions coming up.
Made in America.
Sharply higher at the open, stocks continued to perform well over the course of the day Tuesday.
And I think that bodes well here over the next couple of years for having bigger demands coming to this country.
Now, more of Neil Asbury's Made in America.
Welcome to Made in America. I'm your host, Neil Asbury, together with co-host Dr. Rich Rothman. So, Rich, it's NAFTA. It's NAFTA time. And some great developments, though. Some great developments about the future of trade in America. And we just talked a little bit about Europe and what might be coming there. That's right. I mean, there should be a world without tariffs, a world without duties, right? And why would one country, put tariffs on the United States in far excess of what we do to their products? Unfortunately, it's been going on for a long, long time. But as an American entrepreneur and small business owner and exporter, our company exports about $40 million a year from this country. We're very, very proud of that. Mexico has always been a great trade partner for us. I got to tell you, it always wasn't that way. I mean, before NAFTA, Mexico was a very difficult place to sell anything. I mean, duties were over 100%. And then all of a sudden they came down. and Mexico became one of the strongest, most important export markets of the United States. But that was many, many years ago. And President Trump said we needed to update it, that this was negotiated back in the 90s, a very different world, negotiated by the first George Bush. Remember, he had a very, very difficult re-election. In fact, he lost.
Yes, that's the word I would use.
The Ross Perot candidacy.
Didn't win,
Yes.
he lost.
And then Bill Clinton came in and he went forward with it. And he actually was the one who signed something that George H.W. Bush actually negotiated. So here we are. So what do we do now? And it's not only Mexico here, but it's also Canada, another very important trade partner of the United States. Very pleased to have on the show Chris Garcia, who's the CEO of VICAR Financial. He's also a former deputy director of the U.S. Department of Commerce. He was appointed by President Trump. Department of Commerce, they're the ones who manage our trade. You know, it's the USTR who negotiates, and it's the Department of Commerce who executes.
So that's who Bob Lighthizer works for. He's Ambassador Lighthizer.
Well, you know, he doesn't know. The Secretary of Commerce and USTR are of equal
status.
Now, I think the Secretary of Commerce, we'll have to get Chris to comment on this. He knows better than I. But the Secretary of Commerce is a cabinet-level position, and the USTR in the past hasn't been, but it might have been elevated to that. Chris, is the USTR now a cabinet-level position?
Well, certainly under this administration, President Trump has utilized Bob Lighthizer, who is actually given the title Ambassador Lighthizer. You know, I would say that given that the U.S. Trade Rep's office is actually in, I believe it's in the office of the Executive Office of the President. It's under the White House, and so for all intents and purposes, during this administration, it essentially is a cabinet-level position. And it's interesting that the Department of Commerce, which traditionally in the past administrations has been an underutilized department, during this Trump administration, it is a very heavily utilized department.
So tell us, you know, I mean, you were there. I mean, you worked with Secretary Ross. You were there during the preparation of, getting ready for these important negotiations. So how do you see progress right now with Mexico? I mean, I guess a very important agreement's been announced. The new president-elect of Mexico, Lopez Obrador, is supporting it. So a bit surprising to me, being an ultra-leftist. At least he's been for his political career. Has he changed? But he's supporting NAFTA. He said that he would trash it the first day that he got elected. I mean, this is now political rhetoric. But now that he is president-elect, he is supporting the new trade agreement. And you have Canada's the Foreign Affairs Minister, Chrystia Freeland, who was over in Europe and making a rush to Washington because we got to get a deal done by Friday. So kind of update us on what's going on here and what is the likely outcome.
Yeah, so that's exactly it. So certainly during my time at the Commerce Department, one thing that really stood out to me that is directly related to President Trump's renegotiation efforts is these 232 investigations, these national security investigations, of course, the 301, Section 301 investigations, and these are really used to get bargaining chips on the table, and essentially what the Commerce Department does is it takes a look at some of these exports or imports that we receive from our trade partners, and we look into whether these countries are either unfairly subsidizing those goods that are being imported here in the United States, or if there are other kind of unlevel playing field restrictions such as excessive tariffs. What I saw during my tenure is that there was a huge emphasis and really a significant majority of time of Secretary Ross's attention was placed on these 232 and 301 investigations. Now, fast forward to today, you see the last 5 weeks, President Trump has been focused on renegotiating the terms directly with Mexico in a bilateral fashion. And I think, honestly, that has to do with some of the falling out that happened with Canada during the G7 summit. We were talking about NATO at the time, making sure that countries paid their fair share. And as we thought it was a very cordial, friendly exchange between President Trump and Prime Minister Trudeau, President Trump is flying back on Air Force One, and he looks on his TV screen and he sees Justin Trudeau essentially kind of bad-mouthing, the United States and kind of trying to be a tough guy and saying that Canada's not going to be pushed around. And so I think that really gave the incentive to President Trump to say, okay, well, as we renegotiate NAFTA, let's drive a hard bargain. Let's get on the same page with Mexico. And so we spent the last 5 weeks renegotiating. We reached a deal with Mexico. Now we've kind of put Canada into a corner whereby, as you just said, we have an incentive to get this done by tomorrow. And the Canadian Foreign Minister Freeland did actually interrupt her trip in Europe to come down and fly down to Washington, D.C. to meet with U.S. Trade Rep Robert Lighthizer to get these last details ironed out. And so for all intents and purposes, this has been a rush to finally get Canada to come to the table. But I think that they're here. We're close, and I think tomorrow is still that target date.
Hey, Chris, we're going to take a quick break and come right back and maybe get into some of the details of what would a Canadian deal look like, because it looks like there's some sticking points there. We're talking to Chris Garcia, who's the CEO of VICAR Financial and also the former Deputy Director of the U.S. Department of Commerce. We're going to follow up with the negotiations with Canada. You don't want to miss this.
Made in America.
Welcome to Made in America. I'm your host, Neil Asbury, together with co-host Dr. Rich Ruffin, and we're right now speaking with Chris Garcia, who's the CEO of VICAR Financial. So, Rich, we were talking just a moment ago about the hot buttons with Canada, and it looks like autos and dairy farmers. Kind of an interesting mix.
Well, I'm glad the dairy farmers are there because they had a really high tariff.
Well, they did. What was it, like 300%?
It's 270-some-odd%. I mean, Chris could correct us on that, but pretty high. You're right.
So, Chris, I mean, what is the outcome with Canada? I mean, they are obviously interested to do a deal. They're putting a lot of priority on this. And so what does a deal look like? And is the administration playing a little bit tough here, saying if it's not done by Friday, we're going to put tariffs on your automobiles?
Well, that's exactly it. President Trump has really come into office with the intention to drive a hard bargain with all of the deals he's renegotiating. He truly believes that we've been a little too soft in our past agreements, our past negotiations, and he's saying, to heck with it. We're going to drive a tough bargain. We're in a position of strength. My domestic policies have put the United States in such a great position of strength because we're seeing all-time highs in the stock market. We're seeing low unemployment. We're seeing strong business investment, consumer confidence, business optimism. So we've got the upper hand. So what Canada is kind of forced to do is come to the table because President Trump has made good on his tariff threats. I mean, let's just take a look at what we've done with China. So the president has definitely shown that he is not bluffing, and he's used that to his advantage. So part of the terms of this NAFTA deal, or this renegotiated NAFTA deal, or whatever the president would like to call it, NAFTA 2.0, whatever the new name might be, is that we're looking at the increase of manufactured parts in North America. From 62.5% to 75%. That largely impacts the production of small cars in Mexico, as both U.S. and international car companies kind of find it uneconomical to produce these vehicles in the U.S. and Canada. And so there's also the requirement that 40 to 45% of cars are manufactured with laborers that are being paid at least $16 an hour. That's 4 times the average hourly wage of Mexican workers. So that's actually a great concession that President Trump was able to get from Mexico that Canada will view very favorably. We also gave up the sunset clause. President Trump was driving a hard sunset clause to have the deal expire after 5 years. He's shown flexibility in that and directed Robert Lighthizer, his U.S. trade rep, to say that we would be flexible and have a 6-year renegotiation and have the deal sunset after 16 years. So we've made some good faith effort to really welcome Canada to the table. The path and the road is smooth. And so we're looking to, as you said, the dairy farmer dispute is that if the United States has its dairy farmers looking to sell to the Canadian market, they slap 270% export tariff on that. And that is just not a level playing field. So expect us to drive a hard bargain in that regard and try to get Canada to
But in Canada, isn't the dairy farmers, isn't that a bit of a very sensitive issue? And by having those quotas, it's kind of given stability to pricing and availability of, something that's so important?
Well, it is. And many nations have these industries that are protected. For France,
don't we do that though? Don't we do that to our sugar industry, and we do it to also our agricultural industry in certain respects? I mean, the Farm Bill. I mean, that's so full of pork. I mean,
the strongest lobby in Washington is the farm lobby.
And don't we do the same thing in our country?
Yeah, no, the United States does the same thing, and this is what President Trump is trying to come in here and fix. Anybody that's a free market or supply sider who says, and understands that government intervention distorts markets, it really prevents a truly efficient market from happening, understands that tariff subsidies, these are the bane of our existence.
But why wouldn't Canada come back and say, well, if you want us to deal with our dairy farmers, you got to deal with all your subsidies? And isn't one thing that Republicans and Democrats always sign up for, no matter how egregious, no matter how much taxpayer money is being wasted, is the Farm Bill and farm subsidies?
Yeah, no, a lot of money is being wasted there. Frankly, this is why we've got to. Well, and I'll say this: the ideal is we have to have, free, fair, reciprocal trade, and that means the 3 zeros that the president has been pushing: 0 tariffs, 0 subsidies, and 0 non-tariff barriers. In reality, it gets a little more complicated, and I think that that your listeners have been very well educated by you two in this regard because of your experience. But we have these national security issues that we have to think about, and that's why President Trump was looking at the steel and aluminum investigations. What happens if a war breaks out and all of our steel and aluminum is dependent on the production of foreign countries that we trade with? What happens, how quickly can we start up the U.S. factories again? What kind of a weak position will we be in if an outright conventional war breaks out? So those are some of the minute, kind of the minutia in these trade deals that unfortunately tend to distort the markets. But that's really prepping for kind of the worst case scenario. In the ideal world, we'd have the 3 zeros: 0 tariffs, 0 subsidies, 0 non-tariff barriers. But it gets a little more complicated as we get into the details of these negotiations.
Let me, in the time that we have left, and it's about a minute, I want to go back to the automobiles for a second, because it also says 75% of auto content must be made in the U.S. and Mexico. For Mexico, real quick, 10 seconds, how would that be for Canada?
Well, in 10 seconds, I don't know if I could give you a straight answer, but what's going to happen is Canada's going to sign tomorrow, and we'll see the true details when they come out after the announcement tomorrow.
They're going to sign tomorrow. Okay, well, that's great.
This is optimistic. This is good.
We've been listening to Chris Garcia from VICAR Financial, and he's a former deputy director at the U.S. Department of Commerce, political appointee by President Trump. Chris, welcome. Thanks for coming on this show. We could have kept on going here. This is a wonderful discussion. We hope you'll come back to visit us soon.
You bet. No, looking forward to it, guys.
Coming up, Dr. Rothman and I are going to have some final thoughts for the day.
Made in America.
Welcome to Made in America. I'm your host, Neil Asbury, together with co-host Dr. Rich Rothman. Hey, Rich, it was a great conversation with Chris Garcia. It's previously he was with the Trump administration, Department of Commerce. Certainly has this trade thing down. Very interested to hear his thoughts on it. But, something that it came up is that trade is no longer just economically important or what we make. It's about national security. And President Trump has kind of linked these two, that trade isn't just an economic issue, it's a national security issue. And are you going to be able to defend yourself, in a time of God forbid, war? And what does even a war look like, in this age? What does a war look like? Of course, we know what happens in, some of the more regional instances to where the United States is, kind of not engaged and, not all in. or certainly not fighting one of the major global powers. But what does even a war look like, in this era? So very, very fascinating how trade now has become all about security. Your thoughts?
Well, I think that was a very interesting point. I agree with you. I don't hear other presidents. I have not heard other presidents and other leaders of administrations say that. And that is, think about this. If, in fact, something happened where we could not get certain products that we need for manufacturing into this country, and since the steel industry went overseas, that's one of the biggest complaints that we had. What would happen if we needed it in a time of emergency? Let's call it that. And we didn't have the access to it. That would put this country at a tremendous risk. And I really have never heard another president say anything to the effect that this gentleman just said. And I think that's very intriguing. What if we do need steel and aluminum and all these other exotic metals that are, substrata to what I just mentioned, and we can't get it? That's not good. The F-35, which is an amazing jet, well, it's made with exotic metals. And what if we couldn't get them? What if we couldn't create our weapons? What if we weren't able to get the chemicals that we need? I mean, this is a very serious conversation. Well,
manufacturing today is built on global supply chains. It's the way it is. We've been trained as entrepreneurs, and I'm a manufacturing entrepreneur, that, you rely on raw materials and components from faraway places because they're just not available here for whatever reason. And the other thing is tool making, tool and die making, the way that you form metals, the way that you form plastics, the things that goes into these wonderful products that Americans make. It takes a very robust tool and die sector, but that's a real artisan a trade. It's something that, in Germany, I mean, they're very good at this. They have apprenticeships, they have vocational schools around Taiwan and Korea, Japan, China. They're very good at developing these skills. Well, when we were back in pre-World War II, when we had, all of the immigrants coming from Italy and from Germany and all their tool makers and their die makers.
They brought their skills.
They brought their skills.
Sure.
We could not have fought and prevailed in World War II if we did not have these skills to build all of these weapons. The planes and the Navy ships and the guns and just everything that went into fighting that war could never have happened if we did not have the raw materials or if we did not have the manufacturing skills to be able to make these things. So in the age of global supply chain, you're relying on faraway places to do a lot of things that we used to do. And that's not going to change overnight. That's not. I mean, it's not. I mean, how do we get back our tool and die manufacturing in this country? I mean, how do we do that? I mean, the people who are doing that, they're dying off and nobody's following up behind them. And China has got this thing so down, and they're doing it at costs that are 1/10 of what it would cost us in this country to do it. There's just no financial incentive anymore to be in the tool and die making in this country. And I just don't know how we get it back. I think what I'm saying here, Rich, is this is the tip of the iceberg, to say that this is a security issue because of steel and aluminum. The security issue is so much greater than that.
Well, I think everything you're saying is correct. And you talked about, what if you don't have certain things to make your economy work? What if Japan didn't have the right number of people to make their economy work? What if China didn't have the right number of people to make their economy work? So that takes a nosedive. And in this case, what if we don't have the right people with the right training at the right time with the right material to create the products we need, and we have to get them overseas, except that you can't get there from here because there's an emergency on? It's something, I think, you're right, it is a tip of the iceberg, but you know what? We better address this because we could be in a dire straight situation if we don't.
But the solution is a decade or two away. Hey, Rich, we're out of time. But we're going to be back again next week for another adventure of Made in America, where we never stop fighting for your jobs.